The theme of my 3 lectures is happiness, and specifically the relationship between happiness and virtue. In choosing the topic of happiness, I'm conscious of treading in the footsteps of some very distinguished earlier speakers. In one lecture, Professor Karunadasa spoke about the pursuit of happiness, and in another about the relevance of morality. Professor Dhamajyoti spoke about the Buddha's moral philosophy, and Professor Alan Wallace spoke about the practice of mindfulness and meditation as techniques for the creation of happy states of mind. Professor Lancaster also spoke in his first lecture about developments in genetics and other technologies and the ethical challenges these raise. And I will have something to say about the effect of these technologies on happiness in my third lecture. So my lectures will provide continuity with what has gone before and hopefully introduce some new perspectives as well. In addressing the topic of happiness, I am of course aware of the interest in this subject at Hong Kong University and in the Centre of Buddhist Studies, with your program of the Master of Buddhist Studies in Search of Sustainable Happiness. So I hope students on the course will find something in these lectures to interest them. So here are the 3 topics I'll be discussing. First of all, worldly happiness, that's today's topic. The next lecture will be on spiritual happiness, and the third one on transhuman happiness. What do I mean by these 3 types of happiness? Let's take a quick look ahead. Worldly happiness, as you see on the left there, is basically concerned with external things. These are the kinds of things described in the Pali Canon as things conducive to the, quote, advantage, benefit and happiness of oneself or society at large. They are also referred to or grouped together under the heading of gain, honour and renown. So I'll be explaining in more detail what these things are in a moment. Spiritual happiness is basically a question of things that are internal to us as opposed to external. What this means basically are things that go under the heading of wisdom and compassion in the Mahayana formulation. Essentially we're talking about particular virtues, states of character. These can be divided into 2 parts: intellectual virtues, things like wisdom, understanding, knowledge, insight, all the kinds of cognitive faculties which in Buddhism are referred to as panya or prajna. And then we have moral virtues of the kind listed here, things like generosity, self-restraint, renunciation, energy, patience, the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva, qualities and attributes of that kind. Then transhuman happiness is essentially the use of technology to enhance the first 2 kinds of happiness which I've just referred to. So the use of technological means to increase worldly happiness and spiritual happiness. Perhaps also to produce a new kind of happiness or a new transhuman species, if such a thing ever comes to pass. So that's a quick look ahead. Let's come back now to the first of those 3 forms of happiness, worldly happiness. The question I want to ask here basically is a simple one. Let me put it like this. If happiness is a cake, what are the ingredients that need to go into it? In this lecture I'll try and answer that question by summarising the things we find in the Pali Canon in response to that question. Now these ingredients, as I've called them, the ingredients of happiness, are often mentioned in the texts, but in a very haphazard kind of way. We don't find a neat formulation which brings all these items together, but what we do find are lists of good and bad things, many kinds of lists. So what I want to do now is look at some of these lists, beginning with lists of 10 things, list of 9 things, list of 8 things. This is the standard way which things are described in the text, and see what we get. So here we have a general summary of worldly goods from the Lakkhana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. This refers to wealth, possessions, wives and sons, flocks, kin, friends, colleagues, strength, good looks, and happiness. Okay. Then we find a list of 10 good and bad things. 10 things wished for, desired, agreeable, and rarely gained in the world are wealth, beauty, health, virtuous behavior, celibacy, friends, learning, wisdom, good qualities, and rebirth in heaven. And it's also said that by growing in 10 ways, a noble disciple absorbs the essence and the best of this life. He grows in fields and land, wealth and grain, wives and children, slaves, workers and servants, livestock, faith, virtuous behavior, learning, generosity, and wisdom. Quite a comprehensive list of items there. We find another list, 8 worldly conditions around which the world revolves. Gain and loss, disrepute and fame, blame and praise, and happiness and suffering. Then we find this list, 7 evil things. The immoral person, when reborn as a human being, suffers 7 evils according to the precepts broken. A short lifespan, a loss of wealth, enmity and rivalry, false accusations, being divided from one's friends, hearing disagreeable sounds, becoming mad, the result of drinking liquor and wine. So these good and evil things, in this case evil things, are often seen as a product of merit, punya, or demerit, papa. Here's a list of 5 things. A person who gives a gift out of faith receives 5 benefits. He becomes rich, handsome, is obeyed by his sons, wives, slaves, servants, and workers, receives timely benefits in abundance, enjoys the 5 kinds of sensual pleasures, and no damage comes to his property. Another list, 5 things wished for in the world are long life, beauty, happiness, fame, and the heavens. And the 5 benefits of moral conduct are wealth, a good reputation, confidence in assemblies, an unconfused death, and rebirth in heaven. And we're counting down here one by one. 4 things wished for in the world: wealth, fame, a long life, and rebirth in a heavenly world. Then there are 4 accomplishments applicable to lay followers: initiative, protection, good friendship, and balanced living. These are explained as skill in one's trade or profession, the protection of wealth, association with the virtuous, and living prudently within one's means. So we see there a collection of miscellaneous things, good and bad things, which we could, I think there are roughly 20 or so I've mentioned. You'll obviously notice the same things crop up again and again in different lists of this kind, but here we have a kind of way of putting them all together into a package, all tied up with a pink ribbon. So these are the kinds of worldly goods referred to again and again in the texts. So what we have now is a kind of list of ingredients for that cake I referred to earlier, this cake of representing happiness. Now that we've got this list, what I'm going to do is to try and organize them in some way, and I think we could bracket them together into 6 categories. This is my own way of organizing this material. It may not be the ideal one. Perhaps you can think of a better way. But the 6 categories I've come up with are economic security, health, personal relations, pleasure, and a good rebirth. For the rest of the lecture, I want to look in a little more detail about what the sources tell us about these items to see what more we can learn about them. While I'm running through them, I'd like you to think about which you think is the most important, and perhaps you can give me your suggestions at the end of the lecture. Let's start with the first one, economic prosperity. We heard that mentioned over and over in the various lists I went through. Wealth, or bhoga, is one of the most commonly mentioned worldly goods. It's considered good fortune to be reborn in an affluent family, one which is rich with great wealth and property, with abundant gold and silver, with abundant treasures and belongings, with abundant wealth and grain. Such affluence is often associated with the Chakravarti, or the universal ruler, who is described as rich of great wealth and resources, having a full treasury of gold and silver, as well as, quote, all sorts of goods, and a granary full of corn. Why is wealth so prized, and what are the benefits it brings? The 5 utilizations of wealth, Panchabhogana Madhya, are that through righteous wealth righteously gained, the noble disciple makes himself, his parents, wife and children, workers and servants happy, and properly maintains them in happiness. He does the same for friends and companions, as well as making provision against losses that might arise. He also makes oblations and offers alms to ascetics. The householder who uses his wealth in these 5 ways, quote, remains firm in the noble Dhamma. We also learn that while wealth has 5 benefits, it also has 5 dangers, namely fire, water, kings, thieves, and disputes amongst heirs. It is pointed out that by contrast, the virtues of faith, moral conduct, generosity and wisdom are immune to those dangers. The contrast reveals a key difference between worldly goods and spiritual goods. The former, as goods of fortune, as they're called, are subject to the whims of fate, whereas the latter are not. It is said that a layperson can enjoy 4 kinds of happiness, the first of which is the happiness of ownership. And what householder is the happiness of ownership? Here, a clansman has acquired wealth by energetic striving, amassed by the strength of his arms, earned by the sweat of his brow, righteous wealth, righteously gained. When he thinks, I have acquired wealth by energetic striving, righteously gained, he experiences happiness and joy. This is called the happiness of ownership. The second kind of happiness is the happiness of enjoyment, whereby a clansman enjoys his wealth and does meritorious deeds. And the third is the happiness of freedom from debt, whereby a clansman has no debts to anyone, whether large or small. Lack of wealth can cause much suffering, and we learn that poverty is suffering in the world, getting into debt, having to pay interest, being reproved, prosecution, imprisonment is suffering in the world. Wealth is seductive. Monks who had renounced the world were in danger of being drawn back as a result of reflections of the following kind. My family has wealth. I can both enjoy that wealth and do meritorious deeds. Let me now give up the training and revert to the lower life so that I can both enjoy that wealth and do meritorious deeds. As noted, wealth can be sought and used both righteously and unrighteously. The one who uses wealth righteously makes himself happy and pleased, and he shares the wealth and does meritorious deeds, and he uses his wealth without being tied to it, infatuated with it and blindly absorbed in it, seeing the danger in it and understanding the escape. Wealth is therefore not inherently incompatible with virtue. This is confirmed when the Buddha speaks of three kinds of persons. One is blind, another is one-eyed, and a third is two-eyed. The two-eyed person is one who, quote, has the kind of eye with which one can acquire wealth not yet acquired, and also has the kind of eye with which one can know wholesome and unwholesome qualities, blameworthy and blameless qualities, inferior and superior qualities, dark and bright qualities with their counterparts. The wealthy financier, Anathapindika, who was a generous donor to the Sangha, would seem to be an example of such a person. The second category into which we can group those miscellaneous items is social status. I'll deal with this fairly quickly because I think we all understand what this means. Generally, we're talking about a person's position in society. This was important in the Buddha's day, just as it is today. Perhaps more so in the past, because the Buddha lived in a hierarchical society divided into castes, with the Brahmins at the top. The Buddha didn't think much of the caste system, and the things we hear about in early Buddhist sources that are indicators of social status, apart from caste, are power, authority, honour, fame, reputation, and praise. The more a person has of these, the higher their social status would be. You may recall that 4 of the so-called 8 worldly conditions around which the world revolves are disrepute and fame, and blame and praise. It was also said that a generous disciple is rewarded with fame and authority. 2 of the 5 benefits of good conduct are that the moral person is praised by the wise and acquires a good reputation. Finally, one of the 4 things wished for in the world we mentioned is fame. Third category is health, or mental and physical well-being. Longevity, health and beauty are often mentioned together, and given their common association with the body, we will discuss them together as a group. The Dhammapada speaks of 4 good things, Dhamma, that accrue to one who reveres and serves the elders, namely a long life, beauty, happiness and power. A wheel-turning monarch is said to enjoy 4 kinds of success, Idi. He is handsome, long-lived, free from illness, and dear and agreeable to Brahmins and householders. By contrast, a person without expectation in the world is described as ugly, unsightly, dwarfish, with much illness, blind, crippled, lame, or paralyzed. Good health, both physical and psychological, is highly prized. We are told the greatest of all gains is health. Arogya Paramalabha. Endowment with unimpaired sense faculties is said to be rare in the world. One of the 4 things wished for in the world is, may I live long and enjoy a long lifespan. Health, as well as good in itself, is instrumentally necessary to support the rigours of monastic life. One of the desirable qualities for religious training is that the candidate should be, quote, free from illness and affliction, possessing a good digestion that is neither too cool nor too warm, but medium, and able to bear the strain of striving. Beauty is repeatedly mentioned in the sources. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Brahmin Vacchagotta observes that Gautama's qualities are tranquil, the colour of his skin is pure and bright. Elsewhere we hear that the Buddha's skin is smooth and that he has an upright bearing and a Brahma-like voice. These are 3 of the 32 marks of a Superman. Beauty is not exclusive to the awakened. The eldest son of a Katya king is said to possess 5 attributes. The second being that he is, quote, handsome, attractive, graceful, possessing supreme beauty of complexion. This is the stock description of a fortunate person reborn into a good family. Queen Malika asked the Buddha why some women are, quote, ugly, ill-formed and unsightly, whereas others are beautiful, attractive and graceful, possessing supreme beauty of complexion. The Buddha links this disparity to a particular character trait, namely a propensity to anger. Despite the importance of physical appearance, the Buddha criticizes the suggestion that monks should lead the spiritual life in order to attain celestial beauty in the Deva world. Similarly, it is said that a monk should not consume food for the sake of physical beauty and attractiveness, but only for the support and maintenance of the body. We are also warned against over-attachment to bodily goods, and 3 kinds of intoxication, mada, are mentioned with respect to youth, health and life. One of the most important worldly goods is good friendship, kalyana mittata, which, as can be seen from the Buddha's definition, is valued for the support it provides for the cultivation of virtue. And what is good friendship? Here, in whatever village or town a clansman lives, he associates with householders or their sons, whether young but of mature virtue, or old and of mature virtue, who are accomplished in faith, virtuous behaviour, generosity and wisdom. He converses with them and engages in discussions with them. Insofar as they are accomplished in faith, he emulates them with respect to their accomplishment in faith, virtuous behaviour, generosity and wisdom. This is called good friendship. Friendship is central to the religious life, and the Buddha goes so far as to declare good friendship the whole of the spiritual life. We learn there is no single thing that so causes unarisen, wholesome qualities to arise, and arisen, wholesome qualities to decline as good friendship. King Prasanadi describes the monks as, quote, living in concord with mutual appreciation, without disputing, blending like milk and water, viewing each other with kindly eyes. It is said that when a bhikkhu has good friends, this is, quote, the first proximate cause for the development of the aids to enlightenment, as well as being a quality that serves as a protector. Good friendship is one of the 6 qualities that lead to the non-decline of a bhikkhu, and when liberation of mind has not occurred, having good friends is the first thing that leads to its maturation. Bad friendship, on the other hand, is one of the 4 sources of dissipation, the others being womanizing, drunkenness and gambling. When a bhikkhu has bad friends, bad companions and bad comrades, he fails in 6 aspects of his practice. But when he has good friends, he succeeds in the same 6 areas. Although friendship is a great good, one of the things that paradoxically leads to the non-decline of a bhikkhu is that, quote, he does not bond closely with householders and monastics, socializing in an unfitting manner, typical of lay people. So he does not neglect seclusion, but devotes himself to internal serenity of mind. Similarly, it is pointed out that when a monk who is overly enamored of company and who, quote, delights in a group, will not delight in solitude when alone. The term translated as pleasure here is sukha. The scope of sukha includes both transient pleasures and more enduring states of contentment or satisfaction. Pleasure of a sensual kind, kama sukha, is usually depicted in a negative light due to its unstable and addictive nature. Stern warnings are issued about the pitfalls associated with it. Sense pleasures are said to be perilous, suffering, a disease, a boil, a tie, a swamp, and a whirlpool. Craving for sensual pleasures is the first of the three taints, or asavas, and hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure as an end, is rejected as a coarse way of practice, agalha patipada. At the same time, the enjoyment of sensual pleasure is generally seen as acceptable for laymen. Such pleasures are said to be the reward of generous donors who, quote, delight, rejoice and enjoy themselves in Nandana, the garden of delight in the Tavatimsa heaven. The grosser forms of sensual pleasure, such as the 5 objects of sensual pleasure, Panchakamaguna, can be distinguished from subtler or more elevated forms of happiness, enjoyment, satisfaction or contentment. The happiness derived from sensual pleasure, for example, is contrasted with the satisfaction of renunciation, nekkamasukha, and the happiness of the layman is contrasted with that of the monk. Carnal, samisa, and spiritual, niramisa, happiness are distinguished. And happiness based on what is pleasant is said to be inferior to that based on equanimity, upekkha. In conversation with the monk Udayin, the Buddha contrasts these two kinds of pleasure, speaking first of sensual pleasure. Now, Udayin, the pleasure and joy that arise dependent on these 5 chords of sensual pleasure are called sensual pleasure, a filthy pleasure, a coarse pleasure, an ignoble pleasure. I say of this kind of pleasure that it should not be pursued, that it should not be developed, that it should not be cultivated, that it should be feared. He compares this unfavorably with the bliss of the 4th jhana. This is called the bliss of renunciation, the bliss of seclusion, the bliss of peace, the bliss of enlightenment. I say of this kind of pleasure that it should be pursued, that it should be developed, that it should be cultivated, that it should not be feared. The Buddha contrasts his experience of sense pleasures in his early life as a wealthy young man with the delight he experienced after his awakening, which surpasses divine bliss. Since I delight in that, he adds, I do not envy what is inferior. He says that after his awakening, he became incapable of indulging in sensual pleasures, and thereafter lived a complete and pure celibate life, free from the 7 bonds of sexuality. Similarly, a virtuous bhikkhu practices for disenchantment with sensual pleasures, dispassion towards them, and for their cessation. The Majjhima Nikaya states that someone who keeps the 10 precepts experiences pleasure, sukha, and joy, somanassa. And King Pasenadi provides first-hand testimony of the happiness of the Buddha's followers, observing, I see bhikkhus smiling and cheerful, sincerely joyful, plainly delighting, their faculties fresh, living at ease, unruffled, abiding with mind as aloof as a wild deer's. The 6th category of good things desired is a post-mortem, concerns one's post-mortem destination. Generally, this is spoken of as a heavenly rebirth or a good rebirth as a human being. A heavenly rebirth is often seen as the highest happiness a layman can aspire to. Many monks would be happy to achieve this as well. Chief among the goods enjoyed in heaven is pleasure, and the pleasure of the heavens is more intense and of longer duration than can be experienced on earth. Heavenly sensual pleasures say the Majjhima Nikaya, are more excellent and sublime than human sensual pleasures. It adds, it is hard to find a simile for the happiness of heaven. A verse states, those who desire sensual pleasures rejoice, delighting in the Deva world. The gods live abounding in happiness and are described as beautiful, ablaze with glory, wielding superhuman power while dwelling for a long time in lofty palaces. Although the happiness of heaven is considered to be very special, in fact, there is nothing unique about the happiness experienced there. Heavenly happiness is merely a glorified form of worldly happiness, and the gods enjoy the same good things as human beings. The difference is simply one of degree. Thus, one reborn as a Deva experiences a celestial lifespan, celestial beauty, celestial happiness, celestial glory, and celestial authority. These are the same things human beings desire in the present life. So we could say that heaven is merely a glorified version of life on earth. We might even say there are gods who walk amongst us today, like the billionaire oligarchs who lead lives of incomparable ease and luxury by comparison with the lives of ordinary persons. And even the ordinary person can experience something of heaven. When you go on holiday, for example, if you go on a cruise, a luxury cruise, it's like being in heaven. They give you everything you want, you don't have to do anything, you see beautiful sights, hear beautiful sounds, and all the rest of it. So there's really nothing in heaven that you can't get on earth. The drawback with heaven, of course, is that it can be an obstacle to spiritual progress because there is little incentive to cultivate virtue. There is no need to make any effort. And so in this respect, heaven is a spiritual dead end. For this reason, the gods receive a reality check when they hear the Tathagata's teaching and are, quote, filled with fear, a sense of urgency and terror. Just like heaven, all the other rebirth destinations in Buddhism, in other words, samsara in its entirety, can be defined by the presence or absence of worldly goods. In other words, it is worldly goods that make these realms what they are. Hell is hell because of the absence of worldly goods, and heaven is heaven because of their abundance. The human world, as we know, is situated somewhere in between. So, what conclusions can we draw from this survey of worldly happiness? Well, I think there are three that come to mind initially. First of all, the conception of worldly happiness in early sources is pluralist. That's to say, there isn't one single thing that features as a master value, as a supreme good to which everything else can be reduced. I made a list of 6 categories going through these items. Some philosophers have said there's only one good thing. Several have identified this with pleasure and said the only true good thing is pleasure, and everything else is good only insofar as it gives us pleasure. So that's one perspective. I don't think Buddhism follows that view. I think it recognizes a variety of good things which are independent and valuable in their own right. Secondly, we get the impression from the sources that these sources of happiness are perfectly legitimate. It's good to enjoy them. They're there to be enjoyed. We don't need to be puritanical and wear sackcloth and ashes all the time and feel guilty about enjoying life. These are good things, and they're there to make us happy, and they can make us happy. But there is a condition, this is the third point here. the value of these worldly goods depends on whether they have their source in virtue. So as we saw in the case of wealth, there is wealth righteously acquired and there's wealth wrongly acquired. And the value of wealth is determined by the way it's obtained, how it's used, how it's distributed, and so forth. So these goods don't have a kind of intrinsic value in themselves. They're only good when they're acquired by virtuous means, by virtuous people who use them in the right way. So let me conclude with a classification of the kind which I've just been talking about. These are the same 6 things I mentioned at the beginning, 6 categories of worldly goods. This just puts them into a more systematic kind of framework. So we've got economic prosperity. This can be broken down into 2 kinds, financial assets and material assets. So we here talk about gold and silver and all the rest of it, and we here talk about land and cattle and grain and so forth. Yeah. So I would group all these together under the heading of economic prosperity. That's something which features very strongly in the early sources. Second one is social status. Again, we hear a lot in different places about these items listed here: power, authority, honor, fame, reputation, praise. These are mentioned very frequently in connection with the Buddha and other people. Personal relationships, relationships with one's family, social relationships more generally, and friendship featured as a particularly important form of relationship. Then we saw a lot of talk about health, beauty, mental and physical well-being, longevity, leading a long life. Seems to be desired by most people. Bodily health, very important, both for the religious life and for ordinary people. Mental health came up a lot, and beauty also mentioned several times. We also heard about pleasure, broken down into 2 kinds, sensual pleasure and spiritual happiness. And finally, post-mortem destination. What happens when you die? What's the next life going to be like? Again, that was mentioned many times. People aspiring for a heavenly birth or to a good rebirth as a human being. So that's the way I would group the discussion of worldly goods, worldly happiness in early sources. I don't know whether this is a perfectly adequate classification. Maybe something's been missed out here. I don't know. Perhaps people might think of something else that needs to go in here, or some other way of grouping these items. So one question to ponder is, has anything been missed out here from this Buddhist formulation? Have the Buddhists overlooked anything? Or is this a comprehensive framework for analysing Buddhist worldly happiness? Second thing is, you may wish to ponder, which of these are most important? Or to put it in another way, which do you worry about most? When you talk to friends, sometimes they tell you about their problems. Think about a conversation you had recently perhaps, or when you read in a newspaper in the agony aunt columns when people write in talking about their problems. They usually mention difficulties in 3 main areas, I think. First one is money. People have problems about their credit cards, paying their mortgage, paying their bills, and they get stressed and anxious about this. Another one is relationships, that's number 3. Problems with their wife or partner or husband, family relationships, problems with children, relatives and so forth. And then another one is health, number 4. People find they have various ailments, complaints, diseases, which cause them a lot of anxiety. So those are all important in a way. I'm not sure if any one is more important, but let's say you had to choose, you could only have one of these. Which would you pick? So there's a couple of thoughts for you to be playing around with between now and the next lecture. Thank you very much.